Well, happy Earth Day, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out on this beautiful day to be here with us. My name's Kelsey. I use she, her pronouns. I'm here on behalf of the Connecticut River Conservancy, joined by these lovely panelists who I'll introduce in just a moment. But I first want to give a few thank yous and shout outs, and first and foremost to the Keeney Park Sustainability Project, who has their facility here and is letting us all come in to celebrate Earth Day. I want to thank and acknowledge the DEEP Urban Forestry Equity Grant Program, who funded our volunteer work this morning and who is funding this panel as well. I wrote all these down so I wouldn't forget. We also had a donation of trees from One Tree Planted, and of course a big shout out to Breakfast, Lunch, and Dinner and Jess and the team there for organizing this wonderful event. Sorry, should I move further this way? I only had one instruction, was not to get too close to the speaker, and I failed at that, so my apologies. But this panel here today is focused on tree equity, and we're going to get into defining and discussing that in just a moment, so I won't delve into it too much. But to start things off, I want to, again, a big shout out to our volunteers who came out this morning throughout the city and also right here, who did some tree transplanting, as well as some trash cleanup along Meadow Brook. And I think it's, of course, a really, really important step for our organization and for sustainability efforts across the city and across the watershed to be able to have the opportunity to plant native trees and restore watersheds in developed areas. But I also want to acknowledge that planting trees is really only the first step. And historically, conservation organizations, the environmental movement have ignored what comes after that. So where do those trees go, and who do they benefit? And we know that historically that has been unequal. And hopefully through our conversation today we can learn a little bit more about what's contributed to those factors and how we can continue to change moving forward. So a little bit of an agenda thing today. What we'll do is I'll introduce each panelist, and I'm going to ask each of them the same question. After that, I have some more specific questions for our panelists. And then if anyone else has a question they'd like to jump in and ask, please feel free to come up, raise your hand, shout it out, and we'll be happy to do that. All right, so without further ado, our first panelist today is Alycia Jenkins. She's an emerging scholar, a freelance teaching and performing artist, poet, writer, and activist. She is the Sierra Club CT's Ready for 100 campaign organizer. Alycia is a Trinity College graduate who currently resides in Hartford, Connecticut, where she has lived for the past 11 and a half years. She is a proud African American feminist who believes in the power of liberation of Black and American descendants of slavery families. Alycia advocates to change the world one city at a time by way of environmental justice. Thanks so much for being here, Alycia. And my first question for you is, what does tree equity mean to you, and how does it drive or impact your work?
Sorry, is that good? Sorry. Hello everyone. Happy Earth Day. Tree equity. I will admit that it's relatively a new term, and I think we talked about this a little bit before we came here today. So for me, it means understanding the history in trees and its connection to Black folk and to Indigenous people, and to give us the right to enjoy trees and to understand the history of trees in regards to the people. So that's it in a nutshell.
Thank you. I next want to introduce Charmaine Craig, or Hartford's Tree Lady. Charmaine is a devoted advocate of Hartford's green spaces, committed to grassroots community organizing. Through her continued and tireless work throughout Hartford, Charmaine inspires the community at large to think green and go green. Whether it's at a tree planting, creating food and flower gardens throughout the city, Charmaine is engaged and involved with several local agencies and community activities. Her current project involves serving as Vice Chair of the Hartford Tree Advisory Commission and membership in the Parks and Recreation Advisory Commission, Bushnell Park Foundation, and the iQuilt Partnership, to name a few. She's busy. She stands out for her strong values, people skills, and commitment to the voices of people. Understanding and creating links between communities across cultural lines has become a principle to live by for Charmaine. She's able to couple her grassroots organizing skills with connections created in the area and make a long-lasting imprint on the Hartford community at large and beyond. Charmaine remains devoted to Hartford and is totally focused on building a stronger, greener, and more sustainable city. Welcome. And I'm going to pose the same question to Charmaine. What does tree equity mean to you, and how does that drive or impact your work?
Mic check. Good afternoon, everybody. Tree equity. I won't go too deep right now, but it brings out a lot of different emotions in me. So I only recently discovered this language while I was assisting in reviewing some of the grant applications for the Connecticut Urban Forestry Council. And it startled me at first because I said, oh, and then I looked it up. And I'm going to share the definition because I'm still trying to wrap my arms around it. Trees are more than scenery for cities. They're critical infrastructure that every person in every neighborhood deserves, a basic right that we must secure. But a map of tree cover in America's cities is too often a map of income and race. That's because trees are sparse in low-income neighborhoods and some neighborhoods of color. Ensuring equitable tree cover across every neighborhood can help address social inequities so that all people can thrive. That is the general premise. But the challenges and the awkwardness of the actual circumstance is left to be discussed and fleshed out. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome. And then finally, I want to introduce Heather. Heather is making a special effort to be here with her injured leg, so thank you. She is the city forester for the city of Hartford, Connecticut. Over the past 6 years, she's been managing an urban forest that includes 434 shoulder road miles and almost 3,000 acres of green space and forest land. Educating the public on the importance of trees, climate change, and proper arboriculture practices are her focus. She has worked hard to encourage decision makers to see trees as a necessity and not just a luxury, especially regarding budgeting and planning. Seeing firsthand the social injustices in a city relating to tree canopy gives her advantage from which she can bring stakeholders together to come up with solutions. Heather studied urban and community forestry at Union College in Maine and is a licensed arborist in Connecticut and with the International Society of Arboriculture, and recently acquired her certification in supervising forest products harvesters in Connecticut. Welcome, Heather. And of course, I'm going to pose the same question to you as well. What does tree equity mean to you, and how does that how's that integrated, or how does that drive your work?
Sure. There we go. All right. I know I'm trying to figure out the right spot. Sorry, folks. I can't really shift my whole body over real easy either. So, fancy enough, the reason why I'm in the predicament I'm in is I was pruning a tree. So, go figure, the irony there. So, the whole environmental justice and social equity and everything hits really close to home because I see it every single day in Hartford. During the hot summers, the difference in temperature in certain areas of the city is so drastic, it's unbearable. And this is where people are supposed to live and be able to function, But how can you do that when literally your body is almost boiling, right? So we've got that issue. I mean, I think death to seniors via heat stroke is probably one of the highest. And then you want to consider the asthma rates in this city. Every tree that's planted is absolutely critical. So that's one thing that I really try to preach to folks. But also just the fact that trees don't have boundaries. They're one big community. And if only people looked at each other that way, we would not have the issues that we have in this world right now. So there you go.
Thank you, Heather. And while we're still on you, I'm going to pose my first question to you, which is, can you tell us about what the Tree Canopy Action Plan is, how it was developed, and how that plan integrates consideration of tree equity into the plan and the next steps coming out of the plan?
Sure. So this is actually the Tree Canopy Action Plan. It's huge. It's almost 400 pages. And there was a lot of work put into this document because everything has to be carefully considered, evaluated. We need numbers. There's just all of the things that has to be put together in one place so people have it as a resource, right? It shows us our hot zones, right? It shows us, it's broken down the whole city in terms of priority, where we desperately need trees. And that's not even necessarily on public property. You know, there's certain neighborhoods where I can barely fit a tree. There's like no private or no public property to plant a tree on. So that has to be carefully thought through. The education and outreach needs to really target that neighborhood, because we're all hoping that the residents and businesses will grasp the whole concept of how incredibly important the urban forest is, that they will actually let us plant on their property, or they'll start nurturing and fostering trees on their own property, because it's not just about that one property, you know, it's the whole city involved. This came about through a grant that the Office of Sustainability secured, and it was months and months and months in the works. It involved a lot of different groups and stakeholders, and I'm really, really proud of it because I have not yet seen anything so robust in my career. So I'm really proud of that. And now, obviously, the key is to implement the recommendations, right? At this point, we need to gear up in the very near future, which I hope people start to understand this, to plant 3,000 trees a year. That's a lot. And they need a lot of care and maintenance when they're young for the first 5 years or so. We don't want to just plant and walk away and let things die. So there's a whole educational aspect, there's a whole investment of the city and other stakeholders, and our current canopy cover is 25% approximately. We're looking to get to 35%. So that's planting 3,000 trees for the next 50 years. That's a lot. But it's also very, very, very necessary. So.
Thank you. I've myself spent a lot of time in that document, and I can tell a lot of people worked hard and contributed to it. I'm going to actually kind of build off of something you said and ask a question of Charmaine. When we're talking about tree infrastructure, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the intersection of policies such as redlining and how that relates to tree equity, and in particular if you can relate that back to your experience working on tree infrastructure in the north end of Hartford.
Well, I spent about 10 years at Knox, where I really got to understand the value of trees. Even though I grew up in Jamaica where I was surrounded by trees, it was when I got here that I found out the big impact trees would have on my life, my relationship with the trees, and the subsequent results. while I was at Knox, that was a really instrumental part of the tree planting, because when I first arrived at Knox, the forestry budget for the city was $10,000. There was no planting money. That was just for emergencies. I'm happy to say, as I sit here today, when I looked at this recent um, budget, it is now 1 million, including maintenance, new trees, and removal of old ones. So we have come a long way. We have a long way to go yet. Most of those trees that were planted or have been planted, I would say most of them were public spaces. And the experience of extending the urban forest and including residential sometimes doesn't really flow as it ought to. But in the North End, where I had my most remarkable experiences, a lot of folks there did not like trees, including West Indians. Jack can attest to that. He's sitting there right there because he trained me at Knox and made me go outside and learn the trees in Latin. So um, he said to me one day, "Why don't your people like trees?" I said, "My people? You mean Jamaicans?" "Yeah, West Indians." And it's true, because we found in the North End, it had a big amount of silver maples, for instance, which I think they should have stayed in the forest, in the real forest, because they're not for street or front yards, as they are prone to damage. And it traumatized a lot of people in the North End. And some of them, the West Indian folks coming from the islands, we did not have to rake leaves. So one lady said to me, when I said, "The mayor is bringing free trees because on the Pedro Cigarro we got a chunk of change to do some money with the trees." And she said, "I don't want any trees." I said, "The mayor is giving you free trees." And she said, "Well, you tell the mayor to come sweep up the leaf them later on when them fall down." So, see, that's the sort of thing. So it's one thing to say tree equity. Now, how are we going to get folks who innately distrust, dislike trees? That's the piece of the equation that will really address the equity piece. And remember, we've been redlined. I put it we because mostly where I roll is in those areas where the concrete jungle exists. Trees are sparse. But there's so many other inequities. And I'm going to put this in just to say we're coming in to fix the tree equity part in an area where it's a concrete jungle, poverty, violence, etc. One lady chased me out of her house on Vine Street, and she said, "I don't want any trees. I want the policeman to come up here to stop the shootings." So, the balance of trying to accomplish reef canopy, reforest in an environment of distrust and folks feeling marginalized already. So, we have to look at all of that, and in doing so, look at who is at the table, because those disenfranchised people need to be at the table, not being said, "We've got some trees for you" when it's done. That's it for now. I have more.
Thank you. And over to you, Alycia. Pivoting a little bit, we heard some about how shade trees can be really important in built environments and protecting people's health. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what is this concept of urban heat islands and how these urban heat islands can impact communities, particularly in areas such as Hartford.
Hello? Okay. Be good. To piggyback off what this beautiful elder has spoken on, I feel so honored to be sitting next to you, to be honest with you. I'm so honored. Oh my God. To take it a step further in regards to the redlining piece and to talk about Heat Island, like, in order for redlining to have occurred in the way it did, America deliberately put black folk, mainly those of us who descend from American slavery, and then eventually a black folk who immigrated after, this country deliberately placed us in spaces that were not healthy. Places and spaces where we were suffering from environmental racism, we were suffering from environmental injustices, suffering from food insecurity, and dealing with heat island effects. Like, we were living in inhumane spaces, and the fact that we're still alive is just a testament. So having heat islands means that people in places like Hartford not only suffer the cost of having to pay for cooling of their houses, which they can't really afford. And a lot of the work that I do as an environmentalist and with an energy burden is to alleviate the cost of having to deal with living in a heat island. And I think planting trees, understanding the cultural contexts, which is what the lovely elder Charmaine has said today, like there is a mixture of Black Americans and West Indians and within the city of Hartford. That cultural reverence needs to be acknowledged. So we need to understand that history when we talk about trees and talk about nature, because Black folk have always been connected to nature. Like, we built this country with free labor. We've always cultivated the land. We've always understood the trees, the grass, the soil. And for us to be excommunicated deliberately from it, and then to have spaces like the environmental space that's renewing themselves now, no offense, but like to come in and be like, hey, we're going to give you this nature, we're going to, teach you how to be one with trees. It's like, no, we've always been one with trees, but you took us from it deliberately for decades. So you have to listen to us now and you have to understand where we are. And I think to address the heat island is to understand that cultural dynamic moving forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And actually, kind of building off of that, Heather, my next question is for you, and relating back to bringing more people into the conversation and at the table. As the Tree Canopy Action Plan continues to roll out and those recommendations are implemented, are there ways that community members can advocate for greater tree equity and pull up a chair to the table or contact their legislators about what they want to see in their communities and their areas of Hartford?
Yeah, I think certainly getting involved perhaps with the Tree Advisory Commission, attending some meetings there would be a great start. Talking to the administration right out of City Hall. Really grabbing the ears of folks up at the Capitol is necessary. I know that, through Connecticut Deep, this past year, Connecticut received the highest amount of funding from Deep ever, all at once. So it was $1 million. So that's huge. Like, we're starting to make headway finally. But that's just a little tip of the iceberg. This is something that's just got to be a regular thing. Probably more money, honestly, because we're combating climate change. We're dealing with invasive insects. We're dealing with a whole lot of different variables that are really throwing me off track a little bit, to be honest with you. I'm like, Mother Nature, come on now. It makes it a little harder to do the job. But certainly it's just critical. So the more conversations that we're having, and honestly, and call me if anyone's looking for a way to have that conversation. I'm pretty good at doing that. I can kind of guide you through it. I don't use, crazy terminology in my talk. I need every single person to understand why trees are important. So I'm going to talk to every single person to say, from the heart, like, this is how it is, and hope that message be received. And it has been received. So I hope that this continues. I hope that Hartford and many cities start getting the canopy coverage that they need, that people start seeing the value in, planting that small 2.5-inch calico tree and letting it and nurturing it for years and years and years to come. Because this is not why, it's not instant gratification right now, right? But it's, what is it going to do for us in 50 years, in 75 years, in 100 years? What are your grandchildren going to do? If there are no trees, if Asian longhorn beetle comes in and just wipes out half the tree canopy population in the city, it would be awful. So we all have to be speaking the same language there and really be invested, no matter who you are. Every single person has to be invested. And honestly, the support of that tree canopy action plan, that was very well thought out. I personally am one person. I'm managing all the trees in the city, essentially. It's, 560,000 trees? It's a lot. And they don't just exist within the city lines of Hartford. They're in West Hartford. They're in Wethersfield. They're in, New Britain and Farmington. It's a big area. So the more people coming right here out of the heart of the city, on this mission, the better.
Charmaine, I'm going to come back to you again. And as we talked about a little bit at the beginning, you've had a lot of amazing experiences working within Hartford in different capacities. And I'm wondering, reflecting on your time working in tree infrastructure, if you've noticed any changes that make you optimistic, and then along with that, what areas do you see where we need focused attention and where there's need for increased progress?
Well, sorry, I was getting comfortable here. Well, complimenting what Heather said about the urban canopy action plan, that's a huge accomplishment. And we also have a tree ordinance, which is pretty robust, a model for other towns. As I mentioned before, the vast increase in funding that we've had, and you speak about infrastructure. That word, to me, when trees became a part of the green infrastructure, that's the dialogue. It's just as important as fixing a pothole. It's just as important as quelling the gun violence. If we could do them simultaneously, because that's what I'm thinking as a healer. I come from a healing place. And if you're going to fix the trees, you got to fix the potholes too, and you got to fix the school system. And you have to have fresh local produce. All of those go hand in hand. And it's my hope that that will happen. And the other items that are of interest in terms of progress, we're sitting here today. Look where we are. Look around. We're sitting in this space, and we're giving this space honor for the utility of the trees and for the beauty. And you can watch them as they get dressed again. You see who gets dressed first and how it progresses. And that changes your mental space in a way that, and then you might actually see a hawk go by. So these are the things that make you have that moment. But the second part of the question was?
About where we still need focused attention and where you'd like to see more progress.
Where we still need to focus. I still need to see people that look like me in this audience. Because I feel like we're preaching to the choir here. And the underserved, the marginalized are not really here. And so I've had in my mind for years now, and I bug Heather about it all the time. And because Heather and I go a long way back too. When she came to be interviewed for the job, Jack and I were on the panel. And I said to Heather, you sure you can manage this? 10 years later, she still is. I said, this is a male-oriented society. She said, I could deal with it. And I remember one day when she was in Bushel Park and they had messed up some lindens down there by the train station. And Heather drove up on the sidewalk in her truck and she jumped out and she said, you better treat this like freaking Greenwich protection. So the awareness is key, but also I would like to see more people of color in forestry, in the forestry career path. I know Herb is working on some stuff here with the reclamation of wood debris and creating a nursery. And in this area, I'm hopeful that some of the youth in the area, the schools in Hartford, get a more connection to the infrastructure of trees.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And then my last question is for Alycia, and then after that, if other folks have questions, please do feel free to speak up. And you talked about this a little bit before, but kind of building off this idea that the environmental movement needs to recognize its racist history and its colonial history in order to move forward in a more equitable way. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how historically these factors have contributed to things like tree inequity and urban heat islands, and then how that's affected people's relationships with trees, in particular Black folks' relationships with trees today, and what that means for us moving forward.
Okay, so I would like to answer the last question and then move forward, I guess. So, in understanding the history of trees when it comes to Black Americans specifically, that will make us a better people as Americans and moving forward, just to understand why it is that Black Americans in particular might be very, very hesitant towards the idea of trees to a degree. And that history goes into the fact, and this is harsh, I know that today's Earth Day, but like the fact of lynching. Like Black folk have had a very real fear of trees because of lynching. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be negative, but it's the truth. And we have to work together to cultivate what environmentalists have to do is to cultivate a new relationship with trees that will dispel the fear, or that will help heal. Speaking from what you were saying, Elder, to heal from the trauma of the negative impact of trees. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So, huh? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So I need for us to realize that and understand that there's a healing that needs to occur here in regards to the relationship of trees and nature. Um, and so I guess can you repeat the other questions?
Yeah,
that you
I
had?
really loaded that
Sorry.
question
It was a loaded
with many, many questions. But just speaking a little bit about the history that contributed to things like urban heat island and tree inequity,
yes.
and how we can address that moving forward, which, is a very complicated answer. But
Well, yes. So in particular, a good way that America needs to really like federally needs to really do this work is by virtue of reparations, restorative justice, and repair. And we need more green spaces in every city and every space where everyone lives, and that includes my people. um, and this is a win-win. So when Hartford has, I mean, speaking as someone that's from Chicago, where there is particularly no trees, I'm from the west side of Chicago. When I came out here, I was like, there are trees. I can't believe it. So to imagine and to like dig deep into the work that I've been doing as an environmentalist recently, to see that even though there are a lot of trees here, more than there is on the block that I grew up on, the fact that it's not adequate is very, very telling. So in places like New York, like Chicago, like Baltimore, like these areas also need that same energy. You feel me? I'm going there. So and the holistic nature of it all is when you pay reparations to the people who have been disenfranchised as a result of the restitution of slavery, you have to then give green spaces. You then have to we have to have adequate food, clean water, clean air, and we all need to heal from the dark history in relationship to the tree in this country, which that history differs from the history of what Jamaica has and what the Caribbean has, and we have to understand that those differences are there, but that's what brings us together. So not to separate us because of our differences, but to understand that there's similarity in that, if that makes sense.
yeah,
So, yeah.
We're coming up on time, but I did want to give a moment if anyone out there has a question or wants to come on up.
I have a question for Charmaine. I'll try and talk loudly. Sorry, I have your plugs in, so I have no clue. In regards to the idea of trees implying physical labor for people, I'm thinking about some of the things that might make people unwilling to do that labor. Age, for example. If you're old, of course, you don't want to spend your afternoon raking. Or if you're tired, if you you have to work all these hours, 14-hour days? Like, are you going to come home and break your weeks? So I guess I'm curious if there have been any attempts at making programs, for example, where other people do that labor, or if you think that the solution comes down to more bigger things like giving people a livable wage, or I guess my question is, are there like specific solutions to, for example, or to making trees less burdensome for people, or is it a bigger solution that has to go?
Well,
I'll do my best. Yeah. So the question was related to the labor that's associated with maintaining and planting trees, and if there are specific ways in which folks who are unable to do that can be assisted, or people who are able can take on that labor. And then there was a second part to your question.
I guess, or perhaps the solution is more big picture, give people more reasonable wages and hours and those types of things, so they have time to attend to it.
Right. So, or if the sort of larger scale solution is to pay people livable wage and address the systems that make this difficult in the first place. Does that feel right? Okay. Thank you.
Well, for most people, taking care of trees and nurturing them, whether it be planting or watering or raking leaves, it's a pleasurable activity. From what I've found here, because I remember with my kids, when we made a big pile of leaves, I was jumping in there and all of that. I didn't see it. Mind you, though, as I got older, then that did happen. But I think it's more of a mindset with folks who really have that intense dislike. Because that same lady, I talked her into taking the tree, and it's still there. I drove by on Putnam Street, and it's still there. But there was another lady that Heather had to come and intervene in the Blue Hills neighborhood, because she said as soon as I left planting, she was going to cut the tree down. And so I called Heather, and Heather came up, and she told the lady that it's city property and she'll be prosecuted if she cut the tree down. So there's ways to do it. You can manhandle, you can coerce, and all of that sort of stuff, because lots of folks came in the Blue Hills area again when MDC was coming through. They didn't want any trees because of the big trees, but then we negotiated and we gave them quans and cherries. So there's a middle ground to negotiate through this. But again, to your question, it's not, I wouldn't say it's a big picture, because most people love trees. The people in the West End, for instance, they couldn't get enough of the trees. We kind of had to pull back because they have money over there. So it's going to look weird giving them out. But that's who wanted and who would care for them. And again, with the cultural differences, is the same thing with snow. When the snow falls the first time, we didn't know the snow was going to come back again. So we're out there shoveling. And a few minutes later, the plow comes by and banks up. This lady was out there cursing the tow truck and the snowplow driver, because, again, that doesn't go in your head. But like when the leaves fall off in the fall, I did not know that was going to happen when I came to America. It was a shock to me, and nobody was bothered by it. And I'm going, they're dead. And then I got to see the beauty of the structures without the leaves also. It's a different beauty. And so much enlightened when they got dressed again, as I referenced. Now they're getting dressed again, so I understand all of that. It's an education and an acceptance too. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions out there?
Mind adding a little
Yeah.
that I just thought of. So my partner is African American, and he and I get into some really deep conversations, right? Like, I've not had an easy road in this 20-plus year career being a woman in a man's industry. Not at all. And I know he also has not had it easy because, you know, he's a man of color. And so we've both had to forge our way to a place where we can be at peace, essentially, and still try to fulfill our life purpose and mission. So, you know, I've asked him before, I'm like, how can I diversify this industry more? And he's like, well, you know, when you look at, you know, advertisements from like Steel or Husqvarna chainsaws, right? Do you ever have anyone of color in those photos? No. I'm like, look at you, hon. You're a genius. So it's those little things like that, you know. If folks really knew that this is an opportunity, and business owners in the industry were more open to fostering, right? And this is something that I slowly am kind of pushing at people. You know, that's the behind the scenes work that I do, right? I have those uncomfortable conversations with folks. I guess I'm the person to do it, you know? And I think that's also why we're a team of ladies here that can kind of talk about the injustices and understand and be compassionate about it. So,
Alycia.
Oh, I'm good. So to piggyback off what you just said, the whole practical implementation, the implement notion of making sure that the forestry work is open to Black folk in particular. I emphasize Black Americans because I am a descendant of Mississippi people, and I'm proud of that. What in regards to the redlining, which is what we have been talking about, America, not only when she deliberately put us into red line spaces and took away our trees and forced us to live in heat islands and make us pay the high cost, hence energy burden, to try to cool ourselves in the midst of this, she also deliberately kept us out of the occupation of forestry. She deliberately kept us out of being scientists in the environment, scientists in and studying wildlife in America, in the whole nine. She kept us out of birding. She kept us out of everything that is. And it's the irony of the gag of this whole thing is the fact that we were the people that were cultivating the very thing that we have been left out of the sciences on. Speaking as someone that's from Chicago and from a public school, the first things that are cut is the arts and the sciences, which is crazy to me. And I went to school of math and sciences were cut. And we are deliberately already like cut at the feet, at the leg, at the knee, and at the thigh to be excluded from this work. And to then have people force it upon us and not understand that we have been excluded, and that in spite of that, like the negative connotation with the tree and lynching and hanging and killings and the blood that's in the soils of these old trees in the South and these old trees throughout the Midwest, like, you know, we really need to dig deep into that history. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I have one more little comment. And it's the funding. Because check this out. First it was diversity. Then it was inclusion. Lots of money went into those programs or whatever you want to call them, schemes. And now we have equity. I was playing with the letters because diversity came first, then inclusion, then equity. The acronym is DIE. So check this out. They switch it on us. When you see it, it's DEI. That's the new buzz. DEI. You're gonna see that almost everywhere because there's money coming down for it. But I want to be driving in the front of the bus. I ain't gonna be in the back. Because we got to make decisions. If you're going to tell me what to plant in my neighborhood, I got to be there when the money's being allotted, not after the plans are made. So, inclusion, diversity, equity, all came up on the backs, evolved to solve issues concerning the disenfranchised. Again, we must be at the table. Our voices must be heard. And that's why we're here today. It's the beginning of the revolution. It will be televised.
We're doing it. Oh, yeah.